Rajim. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum to our audience today, and Jazakallah for everyone who's taken the time to tune in today. Today, AMSA is very honored and we're very fortunate that we have Asif Basit Sahib with us, who is the Director of Programming at MTA International. Assalamu alaikum, Asif Sahib.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
How are you today?
I'm good, alhamdulillah. I'm fine, jazakumullah.
Alhamdulillah. Asif Sahib has very kindly agreed to speak today about some of the signs, the heavenly signs of the Prophet Messiah alayhi salam. So Asif Sahib, without further ado, if I could hand over to you on this topic.
TK Yusuf, jazakumullah, thank you very much. I'll try not to speak for too long, and I'll try it doesn't turn monotonous. So, I mean, you want to stop me anywhere in between, you can feel free to do that. I'll try and keep it between 15 to 20 minutes, what I have to say, and then we can move on to questions that you have, or anybody from the audience if they want to ask. So, when we talk about the signs of the Prophet ﷺ, we have become so accustomed to the allegations that our opponents raise against the prophecies of the Prophet ﷺ not being fulfilled, that when it comes to prophecies, generally the outlook usually from our side seems to be apologetic and defensive, and trying to explain why some of them could not be fulfilled, or why some of them appear not to have fulfilled, I should say. But I think that the topic of signs that have been shown by Allah the Almighty for the truthfulness of the Prophet ﷺ is a very vast subject, and it should not be limited to only the prophecies that we are accustomed to listening in terms of allegations that are made by the opponents of the Jamaat. So it should be looked at in a very broader perspective, and we should also try to understand them. The first thing that we need to understand about any signs that are shown by any prophet sent by Allah the Almighty, it's been very beautifully explained by the Prophet ﷺ in terms of miracles, for example. We know that from the Holy Quran, that when the Kuffar asked the Holy Prophet ﷺ to go to the heavens and bring back a book for them, he was instructed by Allah the Almighty that you should tell them that I'm only a human like you are, but I am a prophet, yes, but I am a human. And I cannot humanly do that, ascend to the heavens and then come back with a book, because with our physical bodies, we don't. So that element, when people, there should be a difference between, because a prophet is not a sorcerer, he's not a magician, he's not an illusionist, he's not here to show you signs which can startle you. But even if he was to show, now I'm not quoting the Prophet, but I'm paraphrasing how the Prophet ﷺ has explained this. He says, even if any signs which could maybe satisfy people, or which were demanded by the general public from the Prophet to show, even if they were shown, his opponents would still not accept him, because this is historically proven. When Moses ﷺ turned a stick into a snake, or it appeared to have turned into a snake, the people there, including the Pharaoh, should have accepted the message of Allah the Almighty, which was sent through Moses ﷺ. But we know that that did not happen. He was asked for that clear sign. That clear sign was manifested, and it was shown to the people, yet they did not accept. And then the Prophet ﷺ goes on also to say, if Jesus Christ had the ability to raise the dead back to life, raising one single person from death could have been enough to prove, and the whole world could have known that, such and such a sign has been shown, somebody had died, and there is a person called Jesus, and he has brought him back to life, and that should have been enough for people to accept. Yet we see that that has not happened, even though our understanding of the miracle is different. But if we look at it from the Christian perspective, that he used to raise people from the dead, so one should have been enough. Similarly, when the moon was split into two, or appeared to have split into two, that should have been enough for the whole of the world. People living in Arabia and China and the American lands, or wherever, they would have noticed it, and they would have just come searching for the person who had the ability to show such signs. Yet we see that it did not happen. The Prophet ﷺ says that signs given to prophets are primarily for the purpose of strengthening the belief of the believers. Those who believe Yes, there can be people who see signs and then accept the truthfulness of a prophet, but the primary purpose and the basic purpose of such signs is to strengthen the faith of the believers who believe in that prophet already, because we all need reminders and we all need our faith to be strengthened, and we need to keep strengthening it. So such signs help by way of strengthening the belief of the believers. Now, moving on from there, coming to prophecies, because prophecies are one of the greatest signs that are manifested, that are fulfilled by the will of Allah the Almighty and by the decree of Allah the Almighty, and they serve as a great purpose of people knowing that the person who claims to be from God is actually from God or not. Now, the issue with prophecies is that, again, our opponents tend to forget, and they seem to also make us forget that prophecies of the promised Messiah, salam, in particular, are of two kinds. One of them are those that carry warnings with them, and the other ones are which carry glad tidings with them. All of those prophecies that carried glad tidings with them have been fulfilled. I can list a few, and you can think of even more, I'm sure, because in this time I'll only be talking about certain sides and certain aspects. For example, मैं तेरी तबलीग को ज़मीन के किनारों तक पहुंचाऊंगा. I shall cause thy message to reach the corners of the earth. Nobody can say that the prophecy has not been fulfilled. And we'll come back to how the importance of it. So we're not only just sticking to the fact that, how it has been fulfilled, but we all know that it has been fulfilled, but we'll come back to it depending on how much time we have. बादशाह तेरे कपड़ों से बरकत ढूंढेंगे. Kings shall seek blessings from your garments. How that has happened, I'll give a quick example before we go on. At the moment, we know that the only Islamic leader who goes all around the world and who is invited by various parliaments and other institutions and organizations of esteem across the globe to present the true message of Islam is the Khalifa of Hazrat Masih Maud of the Prophet Islam. Hence, the dignitaries there, we have heard on MTA how the dignitaries afterwards are, we have them recorded. We show only a handful of them on MTA. We've got them in thousands where they come and acknowledge and say that, this is the first time we've heard this type of that Islam has such type of teachings. Otherwise, we've always known Islam to be a violent religion and all sorts of other things to do with the negativity that is being woven around Islam and its teachings. So then we have a glad tiding about a promised son who was to be born to the Prophet Islam, and through him, the message of Islam was to reach the corners of the earth. Again, that is out of so many signs. One of them was that the message of Islam shall reach the corners of the earth through this blessed son that was to be born in the progeny of the Prophet Islam. We know how beautifully that has been fulfilled. Then we have in Al-Wasiyat, we have the prophecy about a second manifestation, Qudrat al-Saniya, i.e. Khilafat, to become manifest and to work as a succession of the promised Messiah Islam. We know that against all odds, Khilafat Ahmadiyya was established and has remained established and has gone from strength to strength, as we can prove historically speaking. So there's so many. All those that have glad tidings, there is none of them which has not been fulfilled. Then we come to the ones that carry warnings. Now, when we come to the ones with warnings, Yusuf, is it all right? I'm not. Am I, going okay, or is it? When it turns warning, you can switch me off, or maybe even log me out if you like. So,
no, it's brilliant. It's brilliant. Jazakallah.
So the other one, when we come to the ones with warnings, again there are of two types. So now we're talking about signs. We've spoken about prophecies, which is one of the major types of the signs that are shown for the truthfulness. And in prophecies, we've spoken about two types, which is one is with glad tidings, the other type is one with warnings. Warnings again are of two types in the prophecies of the Prophet Islam. Some of them were directed towards individuals. Others were directed towards groups or nations or many nations or the human population altogether. In those ones, the allegations are usually raised against those that were directed towards persons or individuals. For example, the one about Abdullah Atham during the debate, which is called Jang-e Muqaddas, or the Holy War, about Pigott, about Dawi, about other individuals, about Sanawala Amritsari, about Abdul Hakim Patyalvi, etc., so many of them. This is where we find our opponents arguing very ferociously and very vigorously that no, these prophecies were not fulfilled. We have our own stance and we see how they've been fulfilled and we feel satisfied about them. And if somebody does not, they should investigate and they should try to find out. They should not hold it back. They should approach someone who can explain to them how prophecies are fulfilled. And we'll come to that in a minute. The ones that were directed towards collectively, towards groups or nations, or the human race, we see that most of them have already been fulfilled in one way or the other, and they might continue to be fulfilled in other ways as well. For example, from history, we know that a diplomat from the Ottoman Empire visited the Promised Messiah Islam in Qadian by the name of Hussein Kami. And he requested Huzur that I've come to know that you have certain powers where you can find out about the future. What do you think about the Ottoman Empire? Can you use those powers and let me know? Huzur explained to him that this is not the way to do it, and I don't use these powers like that, etc. But then when he when he left, that very night, the Prophet ﷺ the next morning reported that I was informed during the night that I was, concentrating and thinking about and meditating about this issue, and I was informed that the future of the Ottoman Empire is not very good, and it's not going to be very pleasant, and it's going to be an unpleasant end to it. And this he informed this information was relayed to the diplomat who had come to visit Hazrat Masih Maud Islam, and it was passed on to him, and he wrote some very bitter kind of remarks in a newspaper afterwards. But we see now, historically, speaking and looking back in retrospect, that the end of the Ottoman Empire was obviously not a pleasant one. It was a very, very unpleasant one, especially bearing in mind that they, the claim for caliphate that they carried. What happened to them is not according to the promise of the Holy Quran, which has been made to Khilafat or Caliphate. That unpleasant and would not have occurred if they were truly the caliphs from Allah the Almighty. Then there is a revelation of the Holy Prophet ﷺ which says, Sultanat Inglishiya ka zawal, the decline of the British Empire. That we see that later on in the time when the British government started to wrap up all of its colonies and heading back home and not being left with all of they were ruling like almost half of the world. So we see that decline also came according to the prophecy of the Prophet Islam. Then again we see that the Prophet Islam prophesied about jihad, and in his poetic verse he says, after saying that jihad is no longer required or permissible, sorry, the way it used to be through weaponry and through artillery or arson. It's not arsenal. It's not permissible like that anymore. And then he says, "Ye hukum sun ke bhi jo ladai ho jayega." Whosoever, even after this clear and express information that I have given and this teaching that I have given, वो काफिरों से सख्त खजीमत उठाएगा. He will have to face humiliation at the hands of the opponents of Islam. Now, what we see is that our opponents didn't pay heed to it. Muslims generally did not pay heed to it, with exceptions of certain groups, of course. And what we've seen is utter humiliation that has been faced by the Muslims, which is very unfortunate. It doesn't make us happy because the Prophet ﷺ himself has, on various occasions, for example, when the prophecy of Lekram was fulfilled and he was brutally murdered by one of his, apparently one of his followers, but then it turned out that nobody knew that man, nobody knew where that man disappeared. But when that happened, the Prophet ﷺ said, it is not time for me to rejoice the fact that he is being killed. I do wish that he had repented, and I do wish that he had refrained, and I do wish that he had not met this end that he has met with the humiliation. So it's not that we are happy when we say that the whole of the Ummah, the whole of the Muslim nation has faced humiliation at the hands of the opponents. But that is a fact, that is a fulfillment of the prophecy, because the clear warning was there from the Prophet ﷺ, yet it was not paid heed to. So, and many more, like, the ones that were directed to, for example, the Prophet ﷺ had prophesied about the First World War, and we see that how that unfolded and how each and every single aspect of the unrest and the chaos and the havoc that the Prophet ﷺ had predicted as a result of this war was fulfilled down to the letter, I would say. And it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that. So warnings for nations, for human beings, for the whole of the human race, we see that they've been fulfilled. And we're seeing that they will, inshallah, maybe continue to fulfill in many other ways that we still do not know. For example, I shall cause thy message to reach the corners of the earth has always, at every stage, we thought, oh, maybe this is what it actually meant. For example, when the Jamaat got its first newspaper, Al-Hakam, in 1897, it was thought, oh, maybe this is how it was going to become manifest. The Review of Religions, which started in 1902, it was thought maybe this is how it was going to happen, because this is taking the message of Islam Ahmadiyyat to the West. Then we had other missions established, say in England. For the first one that we had was in England, and it was thought that this is probably the best manifestation of the prophecy of I shall cause the message of the corners of the earth. And moving on, then MTA was thought to be like, this is, couldn't be better. What else could happen to actually confirm and ascertain that the prophecy has been fulfilled? But then we see, social media coming in, and the Jamaat making the best use of it to propagate and to publicize the message of Islam, and we see how wonderfully it's working. So with any prophecy, we cannot say that this is it and this is full and final. With the passage of time, there will be many ways that the prophecies will continue, inshallah, to become manifest. As far as persons are concerned, where most of the allegations are raised from, for example, the Prophet ﷺ prophesied the end of Pigot in his own lifetime. And that is taken to be and interpreted, of course, not rightly from the wording of the Prophet ﷺ himself, to be taken to be death of that person in the lifetime of the promised Messiah ﷺ as a person. When it comes to prophets and people who are appointed, divinely appointed by Allah the Almighty, we don't see them as persons. We don't see them as individuals only. For example, most of the non-Ahmadis believe, from scriptures again, that Hazrat Noah alayhi salam lived up to 900 years. We as Ahmadis believe that means the 900 years was the age of his nation. That is how long his nation lived. So a prophet is not and should not be seen as a person and an individual, the end of whose life brings an end to his career. That is not the case. The promised Messiah, ﷺ, similarly, his community has continued to grow. His successors have always been, right from his demise, his successors have always been there in his representation, representing him, being his Khalifa and his successor all along. So it's actually a matter of looking at how these things have unfolded and how we need to understand these prophecies. So maybe when Reverend Pigot outlived the Promised Islam, yes, people had a leg to stand on and say, well, this has not been fulfilled because the Promised Islam passed away in 1908 and Pigot passed away in 1927. But again, hindsight and looking in retrospect, at this moment we stand at a stage in terms of the prophecies of the Promised Islam that we should actually be, rather than theory and rather than theoretical arguments, we should be looking at demonstrative proofs. What is the demonstrative proof that we have that we can produce and show and challenge our opponents to come forward and say and tell us how they want to respond to that? For example, I personally had the privilege under the direction of Khalifatul Masih to do a research, an extensive research on Reverend Pigot and his life. And I see it as, I was very fortunate. I believe this is one of the great signs of the truthfulness of the Promised Islam and of Khilafat Khamsa as well. It's a great sign for us that we were to find the progeny of Pigot. So I happened to come across one of his granddaughters, and that granddaughter came to the stage of Jalsa Salana. She first went for Mulaqat. I took her to Mulaqat, and she was very glad to see his Khalifatul Masih. And even there, she said this. And then when I invited her to Jalsa Salana 2012, I believe it was, she came at the stage, on the podium, and spoke to the 30,000+ audience and through MTA to the whole of the world, saying that where she expressed that she had seen what she had seen, that nobody knows her grandfather. There is not a single follower of Pigot in the world at the moment. When I first met her, I asked her, what do you think about the claims of your grandfather? She said, I think they were absolutely rubbish. So there we have Reverend Pigot and we have the Promised Islam, both with the same claim. One, you see, ends up, and it's not today that he doesn't have a single follower. His community had actually just crumbled by 1952-53, but there were still some people, here and there, who claimed to be from his community, but they too have died. And at the moment, there is not a single person who claims to be from the community or a believer of Reverend Pigot. We see that the prophecy of Atham in the great debate, which is called Jang-e Muqaddas or Holy War, people would question, Atham didn't die according to the initial prophecy, and then the Prophet Islam had to make another one and then another one, and that is when eventually he died, which he eventually was going to die anyway, just like any other human being. That is what they say. So we've been arguing for decades on the fact that no, this is how it was fulfilled, or no, this is how it was fulfilled. Again, under the instruction and directive of Hazrat Khalifatul Masih, when I was able to trace his great grandson, and I am witness to a very precious moment and a very unique moment when the great grandson of Henry Martin Clark, who was instrumental in that debate, was face to face with the Khalifa of Masih Maud Islam, and who happens to be the great grandson of the Prophet Islam. So we had their great grandsons sitting face to face, and we had the great grandson of Henry Martin Clark, who was the mind behind and the mind and soul behind the whole of that debate, and a bitter opponent of the Prophet Islam. Him saying, nobody knows my great-grandfather in the whole world. I don't know what the debate was all about. But today, at this moment, sitting before you, Huzur, I can testify that the victory was of Mirza Ghulam Ahmad Sahib. And then he too came to this Jalsa Salana UK 2012, and he too addressed the whole of the audience and the whole worldwide Ahmadis and non-Ahmadis watching MTA, testifying the same fact. So instead of going into details, we can do, if it's an intellectual debate and people want to know some argumentation from our side, but it's essential that we try and produce demonstrative proofs, demonstrative evidence, because we've got a rich history of 130 years. And that it alone itself is enough. Muhammad Hussain Batalvi, all his life, he dedicated the whole of his life for the opposition of the Prophet Islam. Who knows Muhammad Hussain Batalvi? Nobody else, apart from those who read the history of Ahmadiyya Muslim community. So he is alive only through our books. If he's not in our books, he's dead. He's got absolutely no worth and value whatsoever at all. Same is the case with Sanaullah Amritsari. Did he outlive the Prophet ﷺ? Was his prophecy fulfilled, or was the prophecy of the Prophet ﷺ was fulfilled? Let's leave that aside. Let's look at the legacy. Is there any legacy of Sanaullah Amritsari at all? Has any single follower of Sanaullah Amritsari been able to take the message of Islam to the corners of the earth? Has any follower of Muhammad Hussain Batalvi or Abdul Hakim Patialvi or Sanaullah Amritsari, who all of these who claim that their prophecy had been fulfilled at that time, that is the claim that they held at the death of the Prophet ﷺ especially, what have they done? What is their legacy? So in terms of prophecies, it is important not to ignore the element of legacy. Jazakumullah.
Jazakallah, Asif Sahib. That was very, very enjoyable to hear, especially for the research that you've been doing around some of the opponents of Islam. Asif, you've presented such clear proofs of the signs of the Prophet Islam, and to any MD listening, it's it's such common sense that these signs have been fulfilled, and this proves the truth of the Prophet Islam. So why are there still Muslims who, despite hearing these signs, despite having MD sit with them and go through these signs, they still do not accept the Prophet Islam?
Right. Why they don't do that? I mean, it's exactly in line with what has always happened with all of the prophets that have been sent by Allah the Almighty. One, it has always happened. They will not accept because of so many issues. It can be a very long answer that can be given to this, and there are different answers, and everybody would do it in their own way. But I would only like to, for the sake of the students who are listening here, it might help them if when they come across opponents of the Prophet ﷺ in their colleges or universities, first of all, what we need to bear in mind, instead of being defensive, instead of being offensive to them even, what we first need to realize is that we should empathize with them, understand why they should not, or they are not understanding still the truthfulness of the Prophet ﷺ. And in that empathy, we will start to sympathize them. Because if you were Yusuf Saab or any of the Ahmadis in this discussion at the moment, or myself, if I was told that there is a person in the world somewhere who claims to be an Ahmadi, but says that there is no longer any need to accept the Prophet ﷺ. Yeah, but we'll remain Ahmadis, but you accept me and I'll be, you will still be an Ahmadi. I am greater in status than the Prophet ﷺ. So forget about him. I am here, accept me. If you were told that there is such a person, how much of an intention or sincerity in that intention would you have even to investigate? Would you even feel comfortable investigating whether that person is right or wrong? So with the non-Ahmadi youth or the non-Ahmadi layman, we need to bear in mind, this is what they've been told. Their animosity and their hatred for the Jamaat and the founder of the Jamaat Islam is based on something which is not real, which is non-factual, but that is all they know. That is what they've been told. So rather than throwing the evidence and proof after proof after proof on them, we need to listen. We need to listen what they know. We need to find out what is in their mind. And only then is it that we can start clarifying and laying new foundations and building new edifices on it. But that has to be clarified first. So with Tabligh, especially for students who come across non-Ahmadi students in universities and colleges or elsewhere, Tabligh is not only about giving proofs of your truthfulness or the truthfulness of the community or the founder of the community. Tabligh is about knowing what they believe in and why they believe in that. And then maybe taking a strategy How are we going to approach this person? Giving Kashti Anu, Noah's Ark, in the first meeting with somebody might not be the right approach. You might want to know what kind of a mental bent that person has, what kind of tendencies does he have, what kind of interests does he have, and then you decide which book of the Promised Messiah Islam should I give, or should I maybe start with, the um, kinship, justice, kinship, and absolute kindness by Khalifa bin Sirabe. Should I start with pathway, world crisis and pathway to peace? So it has to be a strategy. So, but a brief answer to your question is that it's misinformation, and it's a whole load of misinformation that has been spread, and that is what we need to work on by talking to them, by listening to them, and then finding out why they don't believe in it, and then giving them the information that we think is appropriate for them and can change their minds.
Jazakallah. And just to follow on from that, it is quite a common thing that MD students get into debates and conversation with their Gair MD peers at university. If, for example, you have a Gair MD who is starting to show a bit of interest in Islam Ahmadiyyat, but, apart from a bit of interest, doesn't really have any knowledge on the Jamaat, what book would you recommend for an MD student to pass on to them?
Okay, again, Yusuf Saab, before I speak about I've just spoken about it though, but I would say that the first thing that we all need to bear in mind wherever we are, whether in a school, university, college, wherever, at workplaces, the first thing is in terms of the belief, we all train to be good speakers. Some of us claim to be good speakers. Some of us aspire to be good speakers. But rarely would you find somebody who says, I'm training to be a good listener and I want to be a good listener. That is the key to the belief. It's about listening to them. It's about showing interest in what they believe. You have to show respect to gain respect. If you show no respect for what they believe, even if it's an atheist, if I've done this and it's very successful. If I bump into an atheist, I say, oh, that's great. Wow, I'm very lucky I've met you, because I always wanted to sit down with an atheist and see what they believe, how they believe. Can you tell me something? I'm really interested. Show interest. That is the only way that they will show their interest. Once they start showing their interest, you will get to know about their interests. What else do they like? What type of a career do they belong to? What type of education have they had? What are their educational qualifications? What type of a personality is that person? Is he somebody who wants something quick? Most of us do. Living in the age of Twitter, we want something in a very limited number of words or characters even. So that is when you decide, and you can only decide that when you've read yourself. If you have not read, and if you've only got boxes of the philosophy, the teachings of Islam sitting at home, and every time you go to university, you just put one copy in your bag and you say, okay, I'll hand it out to anybody I bump into today. That is not going to work. So you have to have a thorough, if not thorough, at least a single reading of every book of the Prophet Islam. If it's been translated into English, only then can you recommend a book to them. How would you feel if you gave them a book and he says, well, I'm not very much into books, but can you tell me what chapter to start from or what page numbers to read? It wouldn't look nice if you say, oh, well, I don't know. I mean, just basically it's your choice. Just read from wherever you like. You should be able to say, all right, okay, let me mark the pages for you. If you just, this is where you start from. So there is no one single book. You could find somebody who's got ample time to read, and he could agree to reading Hakikatul Wahi or maybe Ibrahim. But whatever book you give to them from the Prophet Islam, I personally think it should be a guided reading. So, and we can only do that if we've read the book ourselves. If there are guidebooks to understand Shakespeare or Chaucer or Alexander Pope, classic poets and writers, if you go, so if anybody, I don't know if anybody of you here is doing a master's or a degree in English literature, but you will find guidebooks to explain to you that these lines in, say, Macbeth are actually referring to they're alluding to this historic fact. Unless you're given that guidance, you might just skip what it's alluding to. So if those books require guided reading, how can you expect an Englishman living in the 21st century opening up a book which starts with says warning maybe in Tabah, and then he reads that warning, which is to a person called maybe Sanaullah Amritsari, which is a complete stranger for him, just as is the Prophet ﷺ. Or it says, the next thing says a very important announcement, and that is about Sage al-Sasalana, which is going to happen in such and such dates. They cannot understand how books were published or printed in those days. Because the book was going for publication, because money was being spent already, it was thought that it'll be good if we can include this and this pamphlet inside, or this and this tract inside, or this many number of pages, so that it would save the cost. And this way it can get across to people. So if he reads these two and he cannot make sense of that, he will definitely lose interest. So I cannot recommend a single book, but I will definitely recommend that any book that you're giving, you should have done a thorough reading. He says, tell me only 5 pages. You should be able to point out those 5 pages. And if somebody says, I only have time to read 2, you should be able to tell them which 2 pages out of that. We need to understand how the world is working at the moment. YouTube advertisements, you can skip them after 5 seconds. So they make adverts in a way that the first 5 seconds convey the basic, primary, and the most important message. And that message should be catchy enough to let you stay on the air and not skip. But if you even decide to skip, those 5 seconds should have laid the underlay, on what they can build their further advertisement campaigns. So that is my recommendation, Yusuf Saab. I mean, we all know, the philosophy of teaching of Islam is something which catches attention and which catches people's interest, and people develop interest in it. British government and jihad can be very important. Again, knowing what background that person is from, or what his interests or their interests are. So I don't think there is a single but us having read it before we recommend is more important.
Jazakallah, Sahib. I think that's such an important point that you've touched on, especially as students. We spend so much time in our own sort of education and reading our own physics books or medicine books, that we should invest the time in the Prophet Islam's books as well.
Yeah.
I would just like to say to our audience, we do have the YouTube live chat as well. So if you do want to ask a question, please use that live chat to ask us any questions that you have. We do already have some more questions that have come in, Asa, which I'll put to you. One question that we've had that's come in is, what are the similarities in how the Quraysh treated the Holy Prophet ﷺ and how the people of India treated the Prophet ﷺ?
Well, there are many similarities, not only how the Prophet ﷺ has been treated and how the Holy Prophet ﷺ was treated, but similarities with what we know from history about how all prophets were treated. It's very, very similar. Nobody is ready to accept the message. Nobody wants to give up their gods. It's very difficult. Again, put yourself in that position and imagine if you were told that from now you will not worship Allah, we want you to worship something called whatever, lamb or sheep or what, you not start worshiping a cow maybe or something. How would you feel? I mean, you wouldn't even want to consider, because it's embedded in us. Well, in terms of faith of Allah, that is embedded in human nature, but as Muslims, it's embedded in our psychology. We can't just scratch it off. So that has always happened. That is very natural. Again, empathizing and understanding why people do not. That is one thing. But the greatest similarity I see between the Holy Prophet ﷺ, who was not of Palestinian origin, most of the prophets recorded in history, even in the Bible, most of them belong to that certain belt where they would always appear. And the Prophet, the Holy Prophet ﷺ being from a completely different background and a completely different, not a completely, but somewhat different, what do you call it, ethnicity. So they were obviously, so there are so many similarities that we know that there are between the Holy Prophet ﷺ and the Prophet ﷺ. at the advent of the promise of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he was given the indication by Allah the Almighty to migrate to Medina, we all know that there were so many other reasons, but one interesting fact I came across was that it was easier to convince the people of Medina, who were predominantly Jews, about the advent of a prophet because they were actually awaiting a prophet. Similarly, at the time of the advent of the Prophet ﷺ, a prophet was awaited. All religions were waiting in their own capacity, not obviously agreeing with one another, for their own savior or their own messiah or some person to come and reform. It was the age of reform. All religions were actually waiting for somebody to come and save the nation. So similarly, the Prophet ﷺ appeared, and most of the people were ready to accept him. There was a number of people who were ready to accept, but there were many who were not. So there can be many more. I would say, this isn't my, particular area. I might not be answering it very rightly. But yeah, this is just one thing that came to my mind right now.
Jazakallah. And another question we've had come in, Asif Sahib, is different types of signs or miracles appeal to different types of people. And I know you touched on this in your talk a bit, but what are some of the signs of the Prophet ﷺ that appeal to you most personally?
I'll talk about one only at this moment, and I would say that personally, this is one thing. If I wasn't an Ahmadi, this one thing I'm sure would have convinced me to believe in the signs of the Prophet ﷺ. I'm talking of only signs, not teachings. There is a lot in teachings. Jesus being dead is something which makes sense to anyone, should make sense to anyone. Him not coming back with a physical body should. So teachings aside, I talk only, if you've asked about signs, so I talk only about signs, and I take one, which is I shall cause thy message to reach the corners of the earth. The type of work I'm involved in with our archive and research center, which I am a part of, and I work for, is the fact that when you look at the global picture at that time, like I said, it was the age of reform. There were so many people popping up here and there in all countries and continents of the world, claiming messiahship or claiming to be the savior. Like I've just spoken about Pigot. Pigot lived at the time of his claim, he was living in London, which was the heart of the world, the whole world. The largest empire, and then the capital of the empire. He was here. I've been to Hackney Library to see the newspapers, or not only local newspapers, but they preserved all newspapers nationally who were giving extensive coverage to the claims of Pigot. Everybody got to know about him. American newspapers, for example, got to know about it because he was living in London, and you had Reuters in London, and you had all sorts of communication technology or means of communication that was there. London was the heart, and London was the heartthrob of the world anyway. You have Dowie, who is in the United States of America. Again, technologically, at that time, whatever technology was available, technologically rich, and the means of communication available, print and everything, and circulation and postage and all that, and loads of funds. Pigot was somebody who had a community, and who was a community that was known to be affluent, because he was interested in affluent people, and he would convince affluent people to join. Dowie had a large following and large reserves of funds as well, and so many others. You talk of, many people take Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, for example, to be a great reformer of the time. He was somebody with a great following, which turned into the Aligarh movement, and then later on into a university and all that. But it was actually an intellectual movement, and he had loads of followers, and he had a lot of support as well. On the other hand, we see the Prophet ﷺ writing to people to say, I want to publish a book, and I do not have the funds to do that. Oh, Muslim brethren, will you please contribute towards it, because I'm doing this work, this book I'm preparing solely for the purpose of the defense of Islam. And you see majority of the people declining that request. and him not having the funds, publication being delayed. We see that when he's able to publish it, he's written himself, reminiscing how he himself used to write. Of course, he was the writer. How he used to take the manuscript to the scribes who would write the manuscript. Transcribe the manuscript, and then how he would take that copy to the press, how he would go and read the proof, the first proof that would come out, how he would make corrections, how he would take it back to the printers and publishers or printers, and how he would go and collect the books that were published, the copies, put them on a bull cart, or I think that was what is in use, or maybe a horse cart, or something, and then bring them back to Qadian. Then he was single-handedly doing all of that. And that person from a very small, tiny village, unknown village with zero resources, not next to zero, nil resources, gets up and says, I've been told that my message will reach the corners of the earth one day. If that has been fulfilled, and we know that that has been fulfilled, definitely has been fulfilled, I see it as a sign which is unparalleled. You'll find nobody else who was like him with absolutely no resources, having a community which is spread all across the world and is doing all that it can to spread the message of Islam. So for me, keeping my answer short, maybe it's not short, it's already long, but that one sign is just simply amazing. So we need to always look, when we read about the Prophet ﷺ, I would say this particularly, I'm from Pakistan, I've lived most of my life in Pakistan, but the generation here, these youth who have been born and brought up here in the West, there are certain things we cannot comprehend until and unless we have an understanding of what was going on in India at that time. The tiny village called Qadian in the Indian Punjab, we need to understand how resourceless it was, where somebody is ambitious enough to say, I want to have a press of my own because I want to publicize my message. Next to nil resources, he gets it. Launches a newspaper, no resources. Sheikh Yaqub Ali Irfani Sahib wrote to the Prophet ﷺ that Hazur, the Christians have their own paper, the Ahle Hadith have theirs, we should have one. Hazur said, I do not have resources. If you can start with your experience and any resources that you can muster up, go ahead. So that was the situation. So from that situation to us being able to communicate through Zoom and us being able to communicate to the whole of the world, and us being followers of the person who didn't have the resources to publish a book, me knowing that I got Aftab Khan Library here at my left, which is, we've got loads and loads of literature published by the Jamaat, which is there as a proof. I've got the bookstore to my right, which is again full of books published by the Ahmadiyya Muslim community for the propagation of Islam. We know that all mission houses across the world have got publications of the Jamaat, which are distributed most of the time free of charge. We know that Quran has been translated into so many languages in the most beautiful print, as we just mentioned in his khitab, which Hazur delivered in lieu of the Jalsa Salana 2020. So I would say that one sign is an amazing, magnificent sign, and enough to fall in love with the Prophet ﷺ.
Jazakallah. And just following on from that, you gave such beautiful examples of the life of the Prophet ﷺ. One of the questions that we had from one of the students is, how would you advise, and students in particular, to study the life of the Prophet ﷺ? What books would you recommend, or what other sort of ways would you recommend?
I would advise, I've never felt myself in a position to advise. I can only share what I try to do, or what I've tried, and what I found very useful. Reading Malfuzat is a beautiful way of getting to know the life of the Prophet ﷺ firsthand. The best thing about Malfuzat, or the diaries written on a day-to-day basis about the Prophet ﷺ, even if they're not in English, I don't take that as an excuse. With my friends and my colleagues, I've never accepted that as I don't know this language, because I know our youth who go to Czech Republic and learn the language before they, start their courses, going to Bulgaria, going to all sorts of places. I know Christian missionaries who I've spoken to, English missionaries, who spoke in beautiful Urdu with me. So I think that is no excuse. There is no Urdu. I think we should all strive to do that. If we can't, we should at least get somebody to help us. But anyway, so Malfuzat is you actually start to live the life of you start to live your life with the promised Messiah. A heading says Subho ki Sair, morning walk, 23rd of August 1904. Today, Hazur walked from such and such place to such and such place. And during the walk, such and such people were with him. There was a visitor who came to see the Prophet ﷺ and asked this question, and Hazur said this. Today, Hazur was wearing this, the weather was like that, this is what Hazur was wearing. So that is where you start to build a connection with the life of the Prophet ﷺ. And once that is established, once you develop that, you automatically feel the urge to read about the Prophet, the life of the Prophet. And that is when you would go out and find the resources where you can read. Life of Ahmad, for example, is in English language, and it's a beautiful book, and it's something which is beautifully written by Abdurrahim Dadsab. The best thing about the book, I would say, apart from my own affiliation and my own love for the Prophet and Dadsab as well, is that Dadsab served in the United Kingdom for a very long period of time. He knew the Western mentality very well, and he's written the book accordingly. References given, and those points picked up from the life of Ahmad Islam, which a Western mind can easily grasp. So I think we should definitely make it a point to read, at least start reading Malfuzat, so that we start living with the promised Messiah, because that develops a love for the person. And until and unless we have that love, it is impossible to be interested in somebody's life. Why do we start inquiring about somebody's life? It's only when there is something for you in that life. If you've never felt there's something for you in the life of the Prophet ﷺ, you've never been inclined to read it. You will not. All caps. It's because the only reason we want to find out about someone is because there is some particular reason for interest. What do we know about the Prophet ﷺ? He was very pious. My grandfather was as well. The Prophet read 5 prayers a day. My grandfather used to do that. Prophet did tahajjud. Well, my grandfather did that as well. So the only difference between my grandfather and the Prophet would be that my grandfather did not claim to be a prophet. So there must be much, 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 much more that is there and that we need to explore, to know the person who claimed to be what he was and how the truthfulness has unfolded. So one-liner, Life of Ahmad, A.R. Dhan.
Jazakallah. And Asif, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think for those students who can't read Urdu but can speak it and understand it, there is also audio of Malfuzat on Adislam.
There definitely is. Again, I would say, acquaint yourself with people who know Urdu, because even when listening to it, you will still need a little bit of help. There's so many words, so much vocabulary which you might not be able to comprehend even when you're listening to it. Make notes, make some effort. We all have to do that. It's not that being an Ahmadi is not very simple. I'm sorry that I just sit in my nook or my corner and I say, okay, I'm an Ahmadi because I've accepted the Promised Messiah. Who have you accepted? How do you know him? Do you even know anything about him? So the effort to understand the writings of the Prophet firsthand can be done, should be done, and is possible. I've seen 3 Gambian students come from Gambia with absolutely no knowledge of Urdu and being able to read and speak Urdu within a year and a half, I remember. If they can do it, I think all of us can and all of us should. English is not my language, and when I moved to this country, I mean, I did have very basic knowledge. Still, it's very basic, as you can see. And but I'm telling you that I do still try to make effort to learn the language, because I know that I'm living in this country, and I have to do that. The Prophet ﷺ once said, if I knew the English language, I would go to England, and I would knock at every single door and convey to them the message of Islam. We know that language. The Prophet ﷺ said, alas, I don't know the language. We know the language, that language, but then we need to know the message as well. Only then can we be true representatives of the Prophet ﷺ, knocking on every single door. We still can do that with pamphlets in Life of Muhammad to hand them in, but the desire of the Prophet ﷺ was much more than that. So knowing his message firsthand, taking it there, let's become bilingual. Let's make it a resolution. Let's say, all right, okay, that was the desire of the Prophet ﷺ. Anything for the Prophet ﷺ, I will do that, and it will work, inshallah.
Jazakallah. And if I can just follow on that, just for the students who are listening, many students, we are from a Pakistani background, so many students are able to speak and understand Urdu, but having grown up in the UK, myself included in this, struggle to read Urdu. What would be, just to get the ball rolling on that, what would be the way to start to learn Urdu, to read it?
I think the way forward would be what the way forward for many things these days is, you talk to somebody about anything, and Google, which is, in the palm of everybody's hand, is the first point of reference. And you've got so many lessons on YouTube where Urdu is being taught. You can have so much material on there as well. But that is just, to get the ball rolling, as you said. But to keep it rolling, then you will find out where to go, what to do. Talk to somebody. I'm sure people would be happy to help. People take pride in, people feel, psychologically speaking, people feel very happy when you ask them questions. I'm feeling nervous when you're asking me, by the way. But generally, people feel happy when you ask them questions and they advise you on something. So ask people, they'll be very happy to help.
Jazakallah. Asif Sahib, I am wary of the time, but before we let you go, we've just got a few more questions that have come in from our audience. One of the questions is, are there any prophecies that you know of that are yet to be filled of the Prophet ﷺ?
Like I said, there will be many. For example, again, I'll come to a prophecy which is mocked by the opponents of the Jamaat, which isn't really a prophecy as such, but it's a revelation that was vouchsafed to the Prophet ﷺ. Khaks are peppermint, and people laugh on it. Why should you? Why should we be even ashamed when somebody laughs at the revelation? Says, having gone through this phase of the coronavirus pandemic, I'm sure the world has been unfortunate in some ways, but I think all of us have been very fortunate in many ways. One of them is that we know that the world will try to investigate and explore any single herb that is available to treat problems, health-related issues. For example, we don't know what peppermint is going to be useful for example, that is right. But then again, like I said, we've seen the prophecy, I shall cause thy message, being manifested and fulfilled in so many ways. And every time we thought, oh, this is the best that could happen, or this is the best way it could be fulfilled. But then we saw that no, there were other ways that it could be fulfilled. So we can't even say, what I mean to say is that we can't even say that some revelations which don't appear to be prophecies might actually turn out to be prophecies in the longer run.
Jazakallah. And Asif, we've had one more question that's come in relating to your work in MTA and also the research and archive department. It was so interesting to hear, the work around Find the Children of Reverend Bigot, and how they, came to discover Ahmadiyyat and even come to Jalsa. Could you just give us a bit of a flavor and a bit of an idea of your work in that department?
I've been working for the department since October 2014 when it actually came into being. Hazrat Khalifatul Masih, Ayyadullah Ta'ala ibn Aziz, felt that the archives of the Jamaat need to be secured centrally, and that is why it was established, and that is what we are working on at the moment as a team. And we're trying to get that because it's all scattered, all across the world. So we want all of that to be at least in one place. We want that to be accessible to researchers, Western researchers, people working or studying or teaching in universities, writers, historians. We want them to have access to the we want their information to be accurate. What has been happening before is that because we did not have such a repository, researchers would, when they would search for Ahmadiyya, they would end up with the Lahori Ahmadis. And we see in the works of Western writers and Western historians that you will see the Lahori version of Ahmadiyya being dominant in their work, and those teachings being taken as the true and actual teachings of Ahmadiyya. So we try to do that, and so we try to stay in touch with them, and we try to work on similar projects where any type of research is concerned. Maybe for example, um, a person's name appears in one of the writings of the Prophet Islam. We would really like to know who that was and what the significance of that name is. If the Prophet Islam says that recently in Calcutta such and such conference was held, and this is what was said, we would really like to access, obtain, and secure that very reference from the primary source. So something like this is what we try to do, and I would request for prayers that Allah enables us to do it properly in a good way, as per expectations of the First Khalifatul Masih.
Asif, Jazakallah for taking the time with us today. It's been very, very enjoyable listening to you.
Thank you very much.
And I'm sure our audience has enjoyed it as well. Jazakallah to the audience for tuning in.
Jazakallah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Jazakallah. Assalamu alaikum.